线长山又高，处处港口都险要。
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Straight Talk with Xiangyu. Today I'm going to talk about why so many in Taiwan remember Japanese colonial rule with what seems like nostalgia, while Koreans remember it with great resentment. So we're going to dig into how Japan managed to subdue Taiwan, not just militarily, but socially, economically, and psychologically. But before we begin, I want to briefly thank all of my incredible upper-level patrons: Alvin Zhao, Wang Yijing, Michael Kim, Victor, CD14039, Jim Fox, Kabasada Fogo, SCY, Maddie Roxy, Thomas Siegel, Zhang Weiwei, Dolores Austin, and T. Your generous contributions mean so much to me, and words cannot express my gratitude. To all my other patrons, subscribers, and viewers, your support is just as vital, and I am thankful for every one of you guys. So, now onto the main topic. If you know a little bit about Taiwan, you might have wondered, why do so many people in Taiwan view Japan positively, while the average Korean tends to see Japan in such a negative light? After all, both Taiwan and Korea were brutally colonized by Japan for decades. You'd think that kind of shared history would lead to similar views, right? But here's the contrast. When the Fukushima nuclear accident happened in 2011, Taiwan donated more money to Japan than any other country or region in the world. Meanwhile, in South Korea, public opinion polls consistently ranked Japan as the least liked country among Koreans. So what's the deal with this? To understand this, we need to go back and look at the context under which Taiwan became colonized and how Japan actually ruled Taiwan. This episode is not about justifying, the warm feelings that many people in Taiwan have towards Japan. If you've listened to my show before, you probably already know I'm not one of those people who views Japan in a particularly positive light. Instead, this is an attempt to explain why those positive sentiments exist. And as part of that, we'll be comparing Taiwan's colonial experience with Korea's, though I won't be diving too deep into Korea's history this time. That's a conversation I'd love to have in the future with someone more familiar with the Korean side of things. Now, to answer this question, we have to look at the context under which Taiwan became colonized and understand the colonial history of Japan in Taiwan. Again, I fall into the minority of people in Taiwan who are generally critical of Japan. But even I have to acknowledge that the affection many people here feel towards Japan didn't just come out of nowhere. There are historical reasons for it, and today we're going to unpack those reasons. So in 1895, Taiwan was officially ceded by the Qing government to Japan under the Treaty of Shimonoseki, or the Treaty of Maguan, as it is known in Chinese, the Maguan 条约. That moment marked the start of 50 years of Japanese colonial rule, ending only in 1945 when Japan was defeated by the Allies and also got two very big doses of radiation. The thing is, before Japan took over, the people on Taiwan didn't really share a strong collective identity. The Han people living on the west coast mostly identified with their ancestral hometowns in southern Fujian, in the case of Hoklos, or in Guangdong, in the case of Hakkas. Their loyalties were to their clans, not to the island itself. Meanwhile, Taiwan's indigenous peoples identified with their own tribes and communities, also not with any kind of Taiwan as a whole. Ironically, it was only after Taiwan became colonized by Japan that something resembling a shared identity began to slowly take shape, as the island was governed as a whole in a very hands-on approach, as opposed to during the Qing dynasty when it was relatively hands-off. Now let's compare the situation with Korea. By the time Korea became a Japanese colony, a Korean identity already very much existed, and historically, Koreans had looked down on Japan as culturally and intellectually inferior, which for much of history made sense. For centuries, things like science, philosophy, and technology generally flowed from China to Korea, then to Japan. Meanwhile, Japan's historical role in relation to Korea had mostly involved failed invasions and disruptions starting in the 5th century. So think of the Japanese as kind of like Team Rocket showing up in every episode of Pokemon and just being a nuisance in general. Now, all of a sudden, starting in 1875, Japan was trying to force Korea to open its ports and enter trade relations with Japan under an unequal treaty. Kind of like what Commodore Matthew Perry did to Japan back in 1854. As you can imagine, resentment grew, and to the Koreans, it wasn't just about being screwed over economically, but it was a matter of national dignity. Korea, of course, sat between two powers. China, which had traditionally been its suzerain, and Japan, which was hungry for expansion. And in fact, one of the main reasons Japan launched the First Sino-Japanese War was to wrest control of Korea from China. Japan won that war, and as a part of the peace settlement, they got Taiwan. So you could say Taiwan and Korea became Japanese colonies as this sort of package deal. Now here's a key difference between Taiwan and Korea. While Korea was absorbed in its entirety by Imperial Japan, Taiwan was, and still is, just a small part of China. And back then, Taiwan was not just physically, on the edge of Chinese civilization. It was politically on the periphery as well. And that mattered a lot because by the time Japan formally annexed Korea in 1910, Korea had already been resisting Japanese pressure for at least 35 years. We're talking the whole country, including its cultural, economic, and political centers like Seoul, actively engaging in struggle against Japanese encroachment. And that struggle involved, the old and the young, the elites and peasants alike. And over time, this collective resistance solidified into a deeply rooted Korean nationalism forged in opposition to a common enemy, which was Japan. Now back to Taiwan. Even though Taiwan did not officially become a Japanese colony until 1895, Japan had long been eyeing the island before then. In fact, Japan attempted an invasion all the way back in 1874. Around the same time, it had its sights set on Korea. What happened was, Japanese forces landed in southern Taiwan, fought with some of the indigenous groups there, got some reparations out of the Qing government, and then left. That was it. The Qing government, in response, shifted their focus to developing Taiwan more seriously and even lifted the ban on mainland migration to Taiwan to increase the island's population. Because before then, migration to Taiwan was heavily controlled and even banned at times. Though even when it was banned, some people would still illegally cross the strait and search for opportunities on the island. Anyways, what's interesting is the fact that this early Japanese invasion in Taiwan didn't really breed any serious anti-Japanese sentiment here. And why is that? Well, for starters, it was a small conflict that did not impact most people on the island. Unlike Korea, which had a unified sense of national identity tied to a specific homeland, like I said, Taiwan's population wasn't connected in the same way. I mean, first and foremost, there's no such thing as a distinct and unified Taiwanese nation. The indigenous peoples identified with their tribes, and the Han people identified with their clans and hometowns across the strait. And among the Han, you had the Hoklo people from southern Fujian split into subgroups like those from Zhangzhou and Quanzhou, and you had the Hakka from Guangdong. These weren't people thinking, we're Taiwanese or we're Chinese under threat from Japan. They were thinking in terms of family, hometown, and maybe their little village networks. Think about this. For centuries, people from different clans fought each other all the time. It wasn't uncommon for people from Quanzhou and Zhangzhou to kill each other, or for Hoklo and Hakka to have fights over resources. So imagine, you're a Hakka farmer living up in Miaoli, which is in central Taiwan. You hear that some tribal people way down south got into a skirmish with the Japanese. Realistically, would you really care? It's not like your clan was under threat, nor was it a challenge to Chinese civilization as a whole. It was just a little localized conflict, far from your life. Compare that to Korea, where Japanese aggression threatened the entire nation's cultural, political, and spiritual existence. That kind of existential threat breeds resistance, and Taiwan simply did not have that same dynamic. And here's another detail we can't ignore that I kind of mentioned, but we need to reiterate. Taiwan at the time was very much on the periphery of China. It wasn't a core part of the civilization. So when northern port cities like Keelung and Danshui were attacked by the French in the 1880s, the response wasn't, oh no, Taiwan is under siege. The local reaction was far more practical, like, how are we going to export our rice now? Ah, shit, imports are getting expensive. That's the kind of place Taiwan was, far from the political center in Beijing and made up of scattered identities, tribal, local, and clan-based. So when Japan showed up, most people didn't feel like their way of life or their nation was being directly threatened. The idea of belonging to a country or being part of a nation was abstract, but belonging to your clan, now that was real. That was concrete. That was your life in Taiwan at the time. Now you might ask, why did Japan even want Taiwan in the first place, especially when Taiwan was such a peripheral part of China that the Qing did not exercise much control over? There were a few reasons, but one of the big ones had to do with Japan's goal of industrializing. And industrialization requires two key things. One is people and two is resources. But Japan wasn't just interested in simple resource extraction like some other colonial powers. Their aim was to use Taiwan to export agricultural goods and basic industrial products to Japan, which would then free up Japanese labor to take on more advanced work. On top of that, they could also sell their more advanced industrial products back to Taiwan. So yeah, this was about introducing capitalism to Taiwan and modernizing it, but all for Japan's benefit. Fast forward to 1895, Japan defeats China in the First Sino-Japanese War, and as part of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, China is forced to cede Taiwan to Japan. That's when a group of Qing loyalists, many of whom were Qing officials stationed in Taiwan, declared the founding of what's known in the West as the Republic of Formosa. In Chinese, it was called Taiwan Minzhuguo, which more accurately translates to the Democratic State of Taiwan or the Democratic Republic of Taiwan. Now, some Taiwan separatists today like to point to this short-lived republic as inspiration for Taiwan independence, but they're either dishonest or not very well versed in history, because such framing ignores the fact that the people behind it were hardcore Qing loyalists. They weren't trying to create an independent Taiwan. No. They were trying to resist Japanese rule in hopes of rejoining China. Of course, it didn't last long, and within just a few months, the Japanese brutally crushed this nascent republic. But for most ordinary people, life basically just went on. Before the Japanese showed up, Taiwan was ruled by, distant officials in Beijing who spoke Mandarin, a language most people in Taiwan didn't even understand. If you were Hoklo, you spoke Hokkien. If you were Hakka, you spoke Hakka. If you were indigenous, you spoke your tribe's language. Now, even though Hoklo, Hakka, and Mandarin were all Chinese languages sharing a common written language, how many people back then were literate? I mean, these weren't mutually intelligible when spoken either. So to demonstrate, here's me saying, hello everyone, my name is Xiangyu. I am a Chinese person. I live in Taiwan right now. First in Mandarin and then in Hokkien. So in Mandarin, 大家好，我是Xiangyu，我是中国人，现在住台湾。In Hokkien, 大家好，我是Xiangyu，我是中国人，现在住台湾。As you can see, they're less similar than Spanish and Portuguese are. Now, a new group of rulers had arrived, still from far away, still speaking a language the people didn't understand, only this time it was Japanese. So for a lot of people, it just felt like more of the same. The Japanese then did something pretty interesting, though. They announced that anyone who did not want to live under Japanese rule was free to leave Taiwan before May 8th, 1897, and that no one would stop them. Basically, they gave people 2 years to decide, stay in Taiwan under Japanese rule or get out. In the end, only 6,456 people chose to leave, which was less than 0.25% of Taiwan's population at the time. As you might guess, most of the people who left were from the upper classes, the ones who had the means to pack up and move to the mainland. These were people with a stronger sense of national identity, people who likely felt a deeper connection to China. Rather than force them to stay and risk having them stir up anti-Japanese sentiment, the Japanese figured it was smarter to just let them go. As for the remaining 99.75% of the population, it's not that they were excited to be ruled by Japan. They just accepted the reality of the situation. Unlike Korea, where nationalist intellectuals actively mobilized the people against colonial rule, Taiwan did not really have that same ideological engine at the time. Now, yes, there was resistance, but it wasn't nationalist resistance like we saw in Korea. It was more like clan-based resistance against outsiders. And that's exactly how the Japanese treated it. Not as political unrest, but as, a law and order issue. This doesn't mean everything went smoothly after the Japanese enforced law and order, though. Far from it, actually. Early Japanese rule was chaotic. Just maintaining order cost Japan a lot of money. So much money that some of Japan's ruling class thought about selling Taiwan to the French. And on top of that, there was a major economic issue. Tax revenue wasn't what the Japanese expected, especially for an agrarian society like Taiwan. It didn't take long for the Japanese to figure out that the problem was land ownership. A lot of big landlords weren't accurately reporting how much land they actually owned. And beyond that, a huge amount of land ownership in Taiwan was just unclear and not officially recorded. And this wasn't something that began when Japan took over. It was the case during the Qing dynasty as well. So why was that? Well, under the Qing, people couldn't just move to Taiwan and claim land. You had to apply for a permit to cultivate it. And because settling in Taiwan was risky back then, people would usually bring others along for the venture. Once the land was developed, they'd ask the government to inspect and approve it, and only then would they get official land rights and tax obligations. You hear the word taxes, and you can probably see where this is going. A lot of de facto land ownership was never made official or reported to the government. As long as people on the ground knew who owned what, all was good and everyone got to pay less taxes. So when the Japanese launched a full-scale land investigation starting in 1898, they discovered something pretty shocking. 53.5% of all land ownership in Taiwan, so more than half, was unreported. And it wasn't just that land went unreported. The way the land was passed around was pretty messy too. Developers who brought people over to help cultivate land sometimes paid them with land or just leased it to them informally. So who actually owned what? It was a bureaucratic nightmare that took the Japanese 5 years to sort out. And to solve the problem, they came up with this compromise. They bought up land from landlords and redistributed it to the people actually working it to a certain extent. But they also allowed landlords to keep a lot of their land. And clearly this was the case, otherwise the KMT would not have had to carry out actual land reform in Taiwan in the 1950s. So peasants got some land, landlords kept their wealth, and most importantly to the Japanese, the landlords were still powerful enough in local society to be useful. For example, the Japanese relied on the local landed aristocracy to collect land taxes from the peasants. After that, the next order of business for the Japanese was to sort out the forests and mountains. This started in 1910, but unlike the farmland, this time the Japanese didn't give people the chance to claim or keep the land they worked. Instead, they declared that pretty much all the forests and mountain areas were now property of the state. And guess who lived there? Taiwan's indigenous peoples. When Japan was dealing with farmland and rice paddies in the lowlands, they largely left the mountain-dwelling indigenous communities alone, but now they were moving in and claiming everything as their own. So naturally, the indigenous people began to resist. From 1910 to 1915, Japan spent a staggering 19.6 million yen to put down indigenous resistance, and that was a lot of money for the time. So what made this land so valuable that Japan was willing to spend that kind of money to control it? Obviously, it was resources. Unlike the lowlands used for agriculture, the forests and mountains were full of raw materials, especially camphor, which was highly valuable at the time. So the Japanese built roads into these mountainous regions to subdue and control the indigenous population. How many indigenous people were killed? We don't have reliable numbers, but we do know that over 2,000 Japanese soldiers died during the campaign. So we can assume that the death toll on the indigenous side was even higher. After that, the land issue was basically settled, and resistance died down. Many indigenous people, having lost their land and autonomy, began working under the Japanese colonial system. If you want to see what that was like, you can watch the movie Seryok Bale, and watch the director's cut, not the Netflix abridged version called Warriors of the Rainbow. That one kind of sucks by comparison. So Seryok Bale, Seedikbale. The next step for the Japanese in Taiwan was to get a grip on imports and exports. Because let's face it, what's the point of colonizing Taiwan if all the valuable goods here were still being scooped up at rock bottom prices by Western powers? You see, before Japan ever set up shop in Taiwan, Western capital had already arrived and it dominated trade and finance. Let me give you a quick example. When Governor Liu Mingchuan reformed the tax system under the Qing, his administration pulled in 670,000 taels of silver in a year. Sounds impressive, right? Well, in 1894 alone, the British made 2.33 million taels of silver just from selling opium in Taiwan. Now, here's something a lot of people don't know. Taiwan sugar is world class. In fact, sugar exporters in Cuba saw Taiwan sugar as a threat back in the 1950s. Go back to the 1800s, and you'll see that it was actually Americans who first dominated the sugar trade in southern Taiwan, specifically in Kaohsiung, which back then was known as Dako in Mandarin, or Dakao in Hokkien. Eventually, the British, French, and Germans jumped in too. So by the time Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War and took over Taiwan, the sugar export industry here was already almost entirely in Western hands. And it wasn't just sugar that was being traded either. The camphor trade, once monopolized by the Qing, was slowly taken over by Western firms starting in 1891. Even the tea trade became dominated by Westerners. On this topic, the high mountain tea of Taiwan is actually quite good, and I actually drink it every day. To this day, it sells very well on the mainland and costs more there than it does here, so it's good stuff. This isn't to say mainland tea is inferior, but everyone likes variety, and Taiwan's tea holds up well against its mainland counterpart. Anyways, Taiwan did not have modern banks at the time, so how did tea exports get financed? The answer was merchant-backed lending networks. Eventually, HSBC, that British bank, took control of these networks and with them, control over Taiwan's tea exports. Meanwhile, because of how close Taiwan was to the Chinese mainland, most daily necessities like textiles or what have you were shipped in by boat from places like Fujian. So what does all of this tell us? It tells us that when Japan took over Taiwan, they weren't walking into an economic gold mine. They were walking into a market already dominated by the West. And because of this, there were serious discussions within Japan's ruling class about whether it was even worth keeping Taiwan. Like I said, some people in the ruling class suggested selling it. Early on, Taiwan was much more of a money pit than a productive colony. After all, if Japan could not control Taiwan's trade, then their plan to turn the island into an agricultural base while they focused on industry back home would have been dead on arrival. Remember, even though Japan had just defeated China, it was still far weaker than Western powers at the time. So to avoid causing a stir, Japan made a strategic move, which was they issued a declaration to Western countries promising that Taiwan's ports would remain open for business and that tariffs would stay extremely low. But that didn't last long. In 1899, just 1 year after Kodama Gentaro became governor general, Japan raised tariffs to 15%. This move made it harder for Western imports to compete in Taiwan's market, giving Japan a home field advantage. But in sectors where Western powers still had the upper hand, Japan got creative. Take opium, for example. It was dominated by the British. So the Japanese used public health as a justification to ban British opium imports. And they made it seem like it was a moral act. But let's be real. One, that didn't stop people in Taiwan from smoking opium. And two, there's no way that the Japanese actually cared about the health of the people in Taiwan. So what did the Japanese do? They built their own opium production facility in Taiwan, sourced raw materials with the help from Japan's Mitsui Group. Yes, that Mitsui, one of Japan's biggest conglomerates to this day. And they also got some raw materials from the British suppliers, then produced and sold the opium themselves. To distribute it, they created a licensing system. Licenses were handed out to loyalist aristocratic families who supported Japanese rule, such as the Gu family from Lugang. Yes, it is that Gu family, as in Gu Kwanmin, often romanized in a way you'd instinctively read it as Ku Kwangming, major advocate for Taiwan separatism in the 20th century. That bastard's family wealth goes generations back, originating with that family's collaboration with the Japanese during colonial rule. Gu Kwanmin's ancestor, Gu Xianrong, was Taiwan's most prominent collaborator, the top dog Hanjian of Taiwan. As a reward for his loyalty, he got exclusive privileges, including the license to sell opium. That wealth snowballed into what we now know as the Ku's Group, a massive conglomerate that owns CTBC Financial Holding, Taiwan Cement, and more. So when people ask how that family became so rich and powerful, the answer is colonial collaboration. By 1912, the British realized they couldn't compete in Taiwan anymore, especially in the opium trade. And so they exited the opium market completely. From that point on, opium was monopolized by Japanese capital. Ironically, people in Taiwan ended up smoking more opium than they did under Qing rule, and the opium they smoked ended up being higher quality. Now, opium was originally an import, so the Japanese strategy was about undercutting and replacing the British. But what about exports? Sugar, tea, camphor. That required a different strategy. Japan started issuing government bonds at home and used the capital raised to open banks in Taiwan. These banks flooded local industries with investment. And in this process, Japan took control of sourcing, processing, logistics, and sales, basically the entire supply chain. Western businesses, by contrast, had to rely on their own limited capital, or banks like HSBC, which didn't even have a branch in Taiwan. The closest one was across the strait in Xiamen. So even though total Western capital might have been greater, the Japanese had a key advantage, which was they could concentrate their capital in Taiwan, and they did so ruthlessly. At the same time, they offered local aristocrats, the landed elites, ownership stakes in these Japanese banks in exchange for access to their land. This both enabled investment and secured local cooperation. And then the Japanese tackled another major issue, shipping. Why had the Western powers dominated trade for so long? It's because they controlled the ships. They had the best ships in the world. If a producer in Taiwan wanted to export something, Western shipping companies controlled the routes and pricing, and local producers had no leverage. If a local producer tried to build his own little boat, it was too shitty to get anywhere that mattered. So in 1899, Kodama Gentaro, the governor general at the time, launched a Japanese shipping company funded by state subsidies. Whatever the British charged, this company would charge half. So obviously it wasn't profitable, but it wasn't meant to be profitable. It was all about strategic control, and it worked. The Japanese successfully took control over trade in Taiwan away from the Westerners. Japan also invested in infrastructure to support its control over exports. Take sugar, for example. Before, farmers had to figure out their own way to haul sugarcane to Western-owned refineries. The Japanese changed that. They built railroads through sugarcane fields, so now sugarcane could be transported by train quickly in bulk. The trains would just go through the sugar fields, and they would just toss the sugarcane into the trains. And these trains went directly to Japanese refineries. All of these moves, tariffs, banking, shipping, railways, led to one outcome: monopoly control. In 1897, only 14% of Taiwan's exports went through Japanese exporters. By 1930, that figure went up to 90.5%. Since Japan wanted Taiwan to be its agricultural base, they had to tackle several issues. First land, then finance, then trade. After that, the next target was Taiwan's productive forces, essentially the island's ability to produce goods efficiently. Now, Taiwan is not a huge island, but its geography is incredibly diverse, believe it or not. The east is rugged and mountainous, the west is mostly flat plains, the north is subtropical, the south is tropical. Some areas are humid and prone to floods, others face droughts, and the temperature can vary a lot. Very cold up in the mountains, hot and sticky down south. So in other words, Taiwan's agriculture had potential, but that potential was limited by inconsistent rainfall and poor irrigation. So starting in 1908, the Japanese launched a massive 10-year public works campaign to improve infrastructure, especially dams and irrigation. So yes, when people today talk about how much construction happened under Japanese rule, they're not wrong. Without that push, Taiwan might not have developed many of the systems it relies on even now. But here's the deeper question. Do we really have the Japanese to thank? Japanese people planned these projects, but it was people here that did the construction. And if we dig into it even more, we start to ask, where the hell did all that money for these projects come from? Were the Japanese just being generous? Hell no, the answer is obvious. The money came from the people of Taiwan themselves. Sure, irrigation made the land more productive, but that increased productivity didn't benefit everyone equally. Take sugarcane. It could only be sold to Japanese-owned sugar factories. That meant local farmers had no bargaining power. They were stuck selling at whatever price that the Japanese offered. And as sugar prices were driven to rock bottom, many farmers sank into poverty. The land they once owned in many cases had to be sold to Japanese buyers out of desperation. And once they sold it, they didn't just leave. No, they stayed on the very land that they sold, and they worked as, basically feudal peasants for their new Japanese landlords. Meanwhile, Japan no longer had to import sugar from outside its empire. It now had Taiwan to meet its needs. Now, because the Japanese did not really like the taste of Taiwan's rice, they didn't really try to monopolize rice the same way they did sugar. So as a result, rice prices stayed relatively high, and rice farmers were able to live decent lives. So naturally, more and more farmers began switching from sugar to rice. But the Japanese colonial administration saw this coming, and their aim was to maximize total agricultural output, but without losing control over sugar production. So they played it pretty smart. They built irrigation systems that boosted yields for most crops, except sugar canes, which didn't really benefit from irrigation here in Taiwan. The other crops needed more water. And then the Japanese raised water prices just enough to make sure that even if farmers switched crops, they wouldn't make significantly more money. This created this kind of strategic balance. Agricultural output rose overall, which looked good for the colonial government. Sugar production stayed stable, keeping Japanese corporate profits intact. And the cost of all that infrastructure was passed down to the farmers of Taiwan themselves. Now, let's talk about fertilizer, because this part really shows how Japan engineered the entire system to benefit itself. To boost yields, the Japanese strongly encouraged the use of chemical fertilizers. but Taiwan did not produce its own fertilizer. It had to be imported from Japan. It wasn't until the very end of colonial rule that Japan finally established the Taiwan Fertilizer Corporation. And even then, by the time Japan lost the war, Taiwan Fertilizer Corporation could only produce 8% of what Taiwan actually needed. So what did this mean for farmers? It meant, they were taxed heavily. Then they had to buy fertilizer from Japan just to produce enough crops to pay more taxes, to buy more fertilizer, to grow more crops, then pay more taxes, and so on. This was an economic loop. It was a closed circuit of exploitation. When you look at the system, you start to see the broader picture of how Japan managed to rise so quickly in the early 20th century, eventually positioning itself to challenge even the United States. The Japanese colonial model followed a pretty clear strategy. Back home, state-supported capital focused on key industries like shipping, chemicals, and steel. In colonies, Japan ruled with a combination of military might and bureaucratic control. Infrastructure was built not by Japanese investment, but by extracting resources and taxes from the colony itself. And then local private capital like Taiwan-owned businesses was gradually choked out. And once monopolies were established, the burden on everyday people only grew. In Taiwan, this meant the average person was completely dependent on Japan, not just for fertilizer or bank loans, but for even basic daily goods. Japan set all the prices, they controlled supply, they controlled demand, they controlled everything. And yet, the Japanese were very careful, sneaky bastards. They didn't push people to the brink of starvation. What they did instead was they maintained a system where most people in Taiwan were kept in a state of never quite full but never starving. Just productive enough to keep working but never secure enough to resist. It was maximum exploitation with minimum rebellion. And in that sense, compared to what Japan did in Taiwan, European colonialism looks almost amateurish. The British, the French, the Dutch, they bled their colonies dry, yes. But Japan turned colonial extraction into this well-oiled industrial machine. So as we can see, there was plenty for people in Taiwan to be unhappy about under Japanese rule. And wherever there are deep social tensions, there's bound to be resistance in some form or another. Which brings us back to the question I raised earlier. Why is Japan remembered more fondly in Taiwan than in Korea, despite how harshly they govern both? And the answer lies partly in the social structure of each colony. In Korea, much of the land was owned by aristocrats and royalty. So when the Japanese came, they nationalized this land and handed it over to Japanese capitalists. That naturally caused massive resentment. The aristocracy lost their wealth and influence, and everyday Koreans saw their land turned into a tool for foreign profit. So resistance in Korea was fierce and widespread, and Japan had a much harder time maintaining control. Like these Koreans hated the chokbari. Chokbari is the Korean slur for Japanese people. It means pig's feet because the little wooden sandals that Japanese people like to wear, I guess, resemble pig's feet. Anyways, Taiwan was different. Taiwan was made up largely of migrants from the mainland, while the central government of China was on the other side of the Taiwan-Strait, far away from Taiwan. These elites were local elites, but they weren't elites, on a national scale. So rather than uproot these local elites, Japan chose to co-opt them. The Japanese left the landlord-tenant system largely intact, and in fact, they empowered the landlords, like I said, many times throughout this episode. Many of these landlords were allowed and even encouraged to go into industries like rice milling, where they could profit even more. They were given, unfettered access to the Japanese market, and this kind of preferential treatment turned them into loyal junior partners in the colonial enterprise. The Japanese also appointed these landlords to local leadership roles like councilmen, the heads of irrigation associations, and other bureaucratic positions. And in a society where people identified strongly with local clans and families, winning over the landlords meant winning over entire communities. In other words, Japan governed Taiwan not just through military and bureaucratic force, but through strategic collaboration with the existing elite. But that didn't mean there was no resistance. After the initial wave of Qing loyalist uprisings, things got quieter on the surface. But by the 1920s, the Japanese had begun to expand access to education because they wanted an educated industrial workforce. They established secondary schools for Taiwanese youth, which meant more people had access to new ideas, including left-wing and anti-colonial thought. This era saw the emergence of Taiwan's first modern political organizations, like the original Taiwan People's Party, not to be confused with the unrelated party of the same name today, and the Communist Party of Taiwan. These groups gave voice to workers and peasants who bore the brunt of the colonial exploitation. And because the landlords had been absorbed into the colonial system, the working class was naturally more drawn to radical, redistributive politics. But Japan wasn't going to let that, continue. By the 1930s, in response to this growing dissent, the colonial government launched the Kominka movement. That's the Japanese name of the movement, Kominka. The same characters in Chinese are read Huangminhua. So Kominka or Huangminhua, however you read it, literally means to transform into imperial subjects. The goal was cultural and psychological assimilation, turning the Chinese people on Taiwan into loyal, obedient subjects of the Japanese emperor. This meant pressuring, Taiwanese people to adopt Japanese names, replacing Chinese customs with Japanese ones, and aggressively promoting Japanese language, culture, and Shinto beliefs. There were, some legal perks, educational advantages, and social incentives for those who complied. But it was never about equality. Even the most Japanized Taiwanese were never treated the same as real Japanese citizens. In fact, even Japanese people born in Taiwan who were repatriated to Japan after World War II were kind of looked down upon by, Japanese people born and raised in Japan. In reality, Kominka or Huangminhua was less about integration and more about mobilization for war, specifically the war against China. And to do that effectively, Japan needed to strip the Taiwanese of their Chinese identity. During this time, left-wing activists were crushed, many were jailed, forced into exile, or silenced altogether. These were the very people who could have led a reckoning with Taiwan's colonial past. They had the knowledge, the experience, and the political analysis, but they never got the chance. And why is that? Because the Chinese Civil War resumed almost immediately after Japan's surrender, and the KMT had no interest in giving a platform to left-wing voices. Many of these activists were seen as communists or communist adjacent. Some of them actually were communists. So instead of helping the people understand the colonial legacy they had just emerged from, the KMT sidelined or persecuted the very individuals who were most equipped to tell that story. So what we're left with is this kind of historical amnesia. The radicals, who had the street cred in Taiwan to spread anti-Japanese sentiment to the masses, were silenced. And over time, Japan's image in Taiwan softened, not because, the colonial experience was less brutal, but because those who could tell the full story were never fully allowed to speak. If you see my episode on the 228 incident, you'll know I covered some of the social contradictions that made governing Taiwan incredibly difficult for the KMT in the early post-war period. Among those caught up in the chaos of 228 were left-wing intellectuals, many of them the same people who had resisted Japanese colonial rule. But during the incident, as lumpenproletarian violence broke out, their cause was discredited. The unrest made it very easy for the KMT to accuse them of inciting rebellion, and once again, these people were either locked up, killed, or driven back into exile. So ironically, even though the KMT had fought the Japanese for 8 long years, they ended up silencing the very voices that could have made anti-Japanese sentiment mainstream in Taiwan. At the same time, they alienated the local elite, the landlords and collaborators who had thrived under Japanese rule. And in doing so, they planted the seeds for a powerful oppositional force, one that would come to resent the KMT and romanticize the Japanese era. And that's exactly what happened. Because the legitimate authoritative voices, the ones who had truly lived through and opposed Japanese repression, were suppressed, those stories were never fully passed on. Instead, they died out quietly, leaving the field wide open for a new narrative to take hold. All the while, a new generation grew up not under Japanese rule, but under the KMT's White Terror. And while they lived under the KMT's martial law, all they could physically see of Japanese rule were the schools, the roads, the railways, the buildings, the infrastructure that Japan left behind. So it is easy in hindsight for these people to say, the Japanese built things. Meanwhile, when the KMT tried to talk about the atrocities Japan committed on the mainland, atrocities they genuinely fought against, it simply didn't land. That history, to most people in Taiwan, just felt distant, geographically distant and temporally distant. Because after all, most people in Taiwan did not come from families the KMT brought over in 1949. There are many generations removed from the mainland. So that pain didn't feel like it was theirs. My mom is like 6th generation in Taiwan from Zhangzhou, whereas, I have a paternal grandfather straight up from Shandong province. So my emotional connection to the Chinese mainland is, just undoubtedly stronger than my mom's, just by nature of this, how much time has passed. In the end, modernization did happen under Japanese rule, but it happened under brutal colonization. And that contradiction is exactly what gets lost in the collective memory. Japan's colonial rule in Taiwan was brutal, calculated, and exploitative. But because of selective memory, political suppression, and the KMT's own contradictions, that brutality has slowly been erased from public consciousness. What's left is a warped picture, one shaped not by those who resisted, but by those who collaborated. And that's the incomplete memory that still echoes in Taiwan's political culture today. If you want more insights into Taiwan and cross-strait relations, follow me on social media, Twitter, Telegram, Instagram. You can find links below in the show notes. If you have any questions about anything discussed in this episode or anything else, drop a comment on YouTube or send me an email at straighttalk@xiangyu.tw. If you found this episode informative and want to support my work telling stories and contexts you don't often hear in mainstream media, please consider sharing this episode with your friends, subscribing on YouTube or your podcast app, and if you really want to go a step further, you can join as a channel member on YouTube, become a patron on Patreon, or make a one-time donation through any of the links in the show notes. Thank you all for tuning in, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.